Hello, everyone. Hi, Kay. Hi, Dolores. Please do share. I've done some sharing, but so far there's very little. And I'd like a few more people here. I hope you're all doing well. I've got to banish my promo so you can see me. Hi. So tonight, I wanted to start off with a little chart. I also want to say that after watching the debate last night and giving you some words about it, I'm still convinced that the Democrats are not being successful in showing just how abysmally bad the performance of the United States is compared uh, as compared with the international context of how other nations are doing. I know people are really mad about 215,000 fatalities. They still believe it's more like 210,000 fatalities. Actually, according to Worldometer, it's already at 216,000 and will soon be approaching most probably 220,000. And of course, everybody's upset about that. That's a lot of people who've died, but it doesn't introduce the comparative perspective. At the debate last night, Susan Page pointed out that our neighbor Canada is doing far better than we, only having close to a third of the fatalities that we have in terms of fatalities per million. Okay, she did use the idea of fatalities per million, so she was talking about things in a relative sense. What I want to do is drive home tonight the comparison. I've said this before in less precise terms, but at this point, I want to drive home the comparison. So I'm going to use a little chart. I'm going to use a little chart that I worked up here today. I didn't have a chance to make it real fancy, but I'm not sure it has to be real fancy to drive the point home. There are 3 columns on this chart and 15 countries. I limited things to 15 countries because I wanted to drive the picture home. Sometimes people can get lost in details. Of course, on the Worldometer site, there's something like, 230 listings on there, so there's lots and lots of data. But I tried to pick out some countries that were close to the best in the world, some countries that were doing fairly well compared to other countries, and then I also picked up some countries that were doing poorly. And you can see that just by looking at the fatalities per million column. Once again, I cite this all the time, but Taiwan has had 0.3 of a fatality per million. Okay, and the United States has had 651 fatalities per million. So you can see there's a huge difference. But I wanted to turn it into a performance statistic. And I do that in the second column. In other words, not just in terms of fatalities per million, but something that indicates intuitively how much better the performance of other nations is than we. Okay, if we go to the bottom of the table, we see the worst performing nation in the world, except for very, very small San Marino, is now Peru. It has 995 fatalities per million. Compared to the United States, it is performing 33% worse than the United States. I've translated the U.S. score to 1.00. In other words, I've normalized the scores to the score of the U.S. And I've asked the question, how are the Brazilians doing compared to the U.S.? And they're performing at 0.94 of the level, 94% of the level of the United States. Now, some Republicans have been recently saying, well, Sweden, we should have used the model of Sweden and gone for herd immunity here. We would have done better. Well, at this point, if we had performed exactly the same as Sweden did, we would have done a little better. We would have done it better by maybe, instead of having a performance rating of 1.0, we would be 1.12. We would be at 12% better. If we had done the same thing Iran has done, though, we would be performing twice as well as we're performing. If we had done as well as Canada, we'd be 2.58 times the performance we have now. And you go up the table, and you can see that even Germany, with its 115 fatalities per million, if we had been performing as well as Germany, we would be performing 5.5 times better than we are now. But we can also see that Germany, a middling performing country, is far from the best in the world. There's a long way to go from Germany to the best in the world. The Czech Republic, they're performing 9 times better than we. Norway, almost 13 points better. Australia, almost 19 points better. Japan, 50 times better than the United States. Only 13 fatalities per million. South Korea, 81 times better than the United States. New Zealand, 130 times better than the United States. Taiwan, nearly 2,200 times better than the United States. Nearly 2,200 times better. Now, it's interesting to ask the question, how many fatalities would we have had if we were performing as well as some of these other countries, actually each of the countries on the list? If we were performing as well as the Peruvians, we would have had many more deaths, 330,000. Brazil, we would have 230,000. So we're doing better than Bolsonaro. Trump is doing better than his friend Bolsonaro. 216,000. If we were doing as well as the Swedes, we still would have lost 193,000, an unacceptable number. It's shocking to find that if we were doing as well as the Iranians, who were thought of as really suffering greatly from COVID, this point, we would have lost only about 113,000 people rather than the 216,000 fatalities we have had. Canada, if we were like them, we would have had only 84,000 fatalities. Israel, 64,000. Germany, 38,000. Australia, less than 12,000 fatalities. If we had performed as well as Australia, a country of a similar area, though not similar in population, but remember, fatalities per million controls for population, then we would have lost only about, well, we would have saved 204,000 lives. As well as Japan, we would have saved almost 212,000 lives. As well as South Korea, about 213,500 lives would have been saved. As well as New Zealand, 214,000 lives and more would have been saved. And if we had performed as well as Taiwan, almost the 216,000 we've lost would have been saved. We would have had only 100,000 fatalities in the whole country. Now, not everybody can be Taiwan, but we at least should have been able to perform as well as Japan or South Korea, I would think. I mean, wouldn't you think? The countries with supposedly the most advanced medical technology in the world? This is an incredible failure. We've lost 216,000 people. It's really over 216,000 now. We might have lost 215,000, we might have saved 215,900 people if we had been as good as Taiwan, whose performance is the best in the world. If we had been the best in the world, if we had made America great again, we would be grieving the death of only 100 people now. I hope this chart really drives home the point. When you put this in an international context, when you do that, you really drive the point home as to how many people died. And Joanne says, Taiwan shot people who refused to quarantine. Joanne, how many people do you think Taiwan shot? How many people? You think they shot one or two? How many people do you think they shot? I mean, it just doesn't weigh in the scales. It doesn't weigh in the scales. Even if they shot 10 people. When it's COVID or something like COVID, when you're in danger of losing 400,000 people by the end of the year, I mean, the calculus is pretty clear. You have to force people to do what's necessary to lower that fatality rate. You need to do what's necessary. It's a national emergency. How many people got shot in World War II? How many Americans were killed in the Second World War from 1941 through 1945? It was really only 3.5 years. Well, it's over 400,000 Americans who got killed in that particular war. In COVID, how many months has it been now? 8 months or 9 months? We have 216,000. Okay, already by the end of the year, they're saying it's going to be 400,000. That will be 400,000 in 10 months. Much worse than the rate of killing we sustained in the Second World War. I'm sorry, it's the job of the government to stop that. And if it needs to kill a few people to do so, I think that's perfectly acceptable. I wouldn't like to be one of those people. But I'd have enough consideration for other people to wear my mask and to socially distance and to stay indoors until the crisis was over. Kay says, also trying to listen to a Movement for a People's Party meeting on YouTube. Well, tell the Movement for a People's Party about this chart. See what the Movement for a People's Party thinks about this chart. See what the Movement for a People's Party thinks about Taiwan performing 2,200 times better than the United States. I'm sure the Movement for a People's Party would have a thing or two to say about that. Evelina says Germany's probably not doing better due to ultra-right-wing anti-quarantine folks there. And the unwillingness of the Germans to coerce them in the same way the Taiwanese have evidently been doing. Kay says, true, Evelina Pont, they ought to come live here for a while. Shake my head. And Evelina says, well, we should send the white supremacists there instead. I don't think they want any more white supremacists there. I don't think Angela Merkel would like that. Joanne says, not that many, but the fear worked. Well, yeah. I mean, it does work if you're willing to prosecute people heavily for murder with life sentences or capital punishment. It does have something of a deterrent effect. Though capital punishment, in the case of murder, doesn't seem to have a more material deterrent effect than life imprisonment. Maybe the same would apply to COVID. That people who, don't want to wear their mask would be willing to go to prison for the rest of their lives. Kay says, they still have many of their own, and ours do go there when they can. Joanne says, why haven't we changed our direction to save lives? Oh, you know why, Joanne. It's Trump. It's Trump. You need a national leader to organize all the states, to lead the Congress to passing the legislation that will make people do what they have to do to kill the crisis. Kay said, did you guys hear about the Michigan militia plotting to blow up the Michigan State House and kidnap the governor there today? Civil war is coming. I don't know if civil war is coming. because they caught the people and they put them in jail, and they're making very strong statements. And maybe that kind of thing is going to serve to stop what might be coming. Even when it says, you're right, Dr. Joe, Angela Merkel doesn't want that. Okay, I know she doesn't. Anyway, with that, I wanted to move on to some other COVID-related news items that I'm not going to spend too much time on. First article from Truthout: the super spreader Trump returns to the Oval Office despite being contagious. And this was written by Alexis Goldstein. It's from October 5th, actually. And what she talks about is Trump, still infected with coronavirus, left isolation Wednesday afternoon and worked from the Oval Office, requiring staff to wear PPE like a gown, surgical mask, and eye protectors supplied at a so-called isolation cart. So there is his recklessness and his obfuscation about how seriously he is ill and what his health status is. She mentions the danger to go to Joe Biden, how the debate on the 29th relied on an honor system that allowed the Trump campaign, which arrived too late to test and get back results on site, to enter anyway. But it's possible Trump hadn't been tested for days before the debate. Of course, as we all know, there was a danger that Joe Biden might have caught something. Looks like he's all right thus far as we know. But there's no question that, doesn't seem to be any question that Trump endangered him. Senator Mike Lee experienced symptoms on October 1st, but he went to the Senate anyway, and he potentially exposed his colleagues. Senator Mitch McConnell is obfuscating too. He's refused to tell reporters the last time he was tested. And Chuck Grassley, who's 87 years old and third in line of succession after House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, has said he will not bother to get tested. Well, he probably figured he might be just as happy to die off anyway, right? 87. I hope no one says that about me when I'm 87. Gee, I hope I get to be 87. Senator Ron Johnson got tested for COVID on October 2nd. He didn't quarantine either. He went to an Oktoberfest-themed fundraiser without knowing whether he was infected with COVID. And guess what? He was infected with COVID, and he had luncheons with other senators from the Republican Party. And Senator Roger Wicker was photographed with his mask below his face on a Delta flight out of Washington, D.C., leading to the airline announcing it would investigate the incident. The Republican Senate caucus is meeting 3 times a week in person for lunch. They remove their masks while eating and talking. Nice to know, right? They want to spread it throughout the whole Senate. Admiral Charles Ray, the vice commandant of the Coast Guard, tested positive on Monday. This created a risk exposure throughout the senior military leadership, led all the Joint Chiefs of Staff to quarantine. At least they were smart enough to quarantine. But Ray attended a September 27th event at the White House with Gold Star families where guests were indoors without masks. Now, look at that picture. Look at that picture. Look at these people sitting so close together. They're not socially distancing. Those are Gold Star families. The admiral looks like he's in the last row, so he would spew forth COVID particles onto the people in front of him. There's over to the right of your picture is the head of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf. He's the guy who's been sending the troops into all the cities across the United States. He's not too far from the admiral. Look at that. Isn't that something? Isn't that disgraceful? These people are a national disgrace. They really are. Trump is listening as songs are sung at a remembrance candle lighting. You know, a great way to spread COVID is to sing songs. This was September 27, 2020 in the East Room of the White House. Kayleigh McEnany, you know about, I always refer to her as McEnany. Can't help it. Anyway, the article goes on with all the people who were put in danger and people who were infected. Pretty good article from Truth Out. I linked to it so you can take a look at it. Okay. So, okay, next. I'm going to share another article from Dave Dayen at The Prospect. It's about the stimulus bill, or the lack of it. Let me get up to the top here. Dave reminds us that he told us at the beginning, as also reported here. I went through one of his articles way back in March, when people were considering the CARES Act. And he says, this base has been insistent the Democrats were likely to get only one bite at the stimulus apple. This basic truth, informed by being alive during the financial crisis and early Obama administration, was my animating principle for everything that came afterwards. If you believe there was only one shot, the first bill had to be negotiated like it was the last. Of course, we now have confirmation that there was only one shot. At least it's looking that way now, because Trump called a halt to the stimulus talks. He says, I take no pleasure in being correct, because there are millions of people who will be forced into economic ruin with little or no help from their government during the pandemic. This isn't a time for gloating. It's a tragedy, and it also provides some lessons. What are we to make of Trump, for example, tweeting an end to the relief talks being held by Nancy Pelosi and Mnuchin, only to apparently restart them last night? Let's get a date on this. I think this was October 7th. Yeah, October 7th, so just yesterday. So what he's talking about is what Trump did, backing off on October 6th. And then he says, being on a powerful steroid that makes you stay up all night is probably the culprit. As you may remember, I I opined on Tuesday night. But the biggest reason is that Trump's not in control of the situation. Mitch McConnell is. And he rather brilliantly got Trump to take the fall for it. I think I told you about that too, how I thought that what probably changed Trump's mind and got him to walk away from the talks was probably a phone call from Mitch. Jeff Stein of the Washington Post reported out the fact that the end of talks came right after McConnell held a phone call with Trump, says Dave. And, quote, suggested that Speaker Pelosi was stringing him along and no deal she cut with the secretary could pass the Senate, unquote. So McConnell knew how to push Trump's buttons. Speaker Pelosi, that uppity woman has been stringing you along. She's been making a fool of you in these negotiations. She hasn't been negotiating in good faith. So Trump, of course, rather predictably reacts, I'll get her. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to take away the deal. Dave says people are wondering why Trump would commit political suicide by denying economic help weeks before an election, when it was McConnell who ended things all along. Of course, McConnell did not want a deal. He doesn't want anything to stand in the way of the Amy Coney Barrett thing. Because Trump is so easily manipulable, he took McConnell's statement that Nancy Pelosi was playing him at face value and took ownership of walking away from the bargaining table, like the art of the deal tells him to do. Only later did he realize that when you do that in public, you become the man who denied relief to the nation. And subsequently, he frantically tried to backpedal, offering to sign standalone bills for a $25 billion airline bailout, for a resumption of the PPP program for small businesses, and another $1,200 stimulus check. Oh, joy. That's maybe fun to comment on. The $135 billion PPP funding he offered was what was left over in the program when it expired. They couldn't give free money away last time, says Dave. I don't know why resuming it 2 or 3 months later to small businesses with no cash reserves would be any different, but it's also useless. The important thing to understand is that this was McConnell's plug to pull. He's in charge now. He is. Trump doesn't seem able to move McConnell at all. There's some blame to Nancy Pelosi for not taking a $1.6 trillion offer from Secretary Mnuchin, from the White House actually. But pay attention to McConnell's statement above, quote, no deal she cut with Mnuchin could pass the Senate, unquote. That includes the $1.6 trillion. So Nancy Pelosi knew this. So what was she trying to do? Well, many people say she was just as happy not to have a deal and place it on the president, the blame on the president or on Mitch. But it might also be true that she wanted to make a deal that would actually work for some period of time. And to do that, she needed to get the president to go after Mitch. That maybe what she was trying to do was to get the president to go after Mitch. But she was unsuccessful at that. Instead, Mitch got the president to go after her. Except in doing so, he was going after himself. Anyway, McConnell barely got a caucus majority for a $300 billion package. Large numbers of his caucus are thinking about 2024 and adopting a Tea Party-style fiscal responsibility posture. after, of course, they've practiced anything but when they were in the White House. Somehow, I don't think that's going to win them more votes, okay, in the country, since everybody knows they were lying the first time now. So at one level, McConnell is just expressing reality, says Dave. He can't pass a bill with mostly Republicans, and he's never been interested in passing one with mostly Democrats. And Dave says if there's one thing that would hurt his reelection chances, it's that. I don't know if I believe that. I mean, I know Mitch has a race in Kentucky. It's not actually that close a race right now. But I can't believe with all those poor Kentuckians who have no money and need stimulus relief and unemployment relief. I mean, they're dirt poor down there. If he does something for them, okay, at this point, and he's the one who does it and he grabs the credit, that should sew up his race with Amy McGrath, I think. Because she ain't the most exciting candidate or the most credible candidate after all the back and forth she's had in this campaign. But there's an even better explanation, says Dave, for why McConnell would destroy his party standing before the election. The answer is because he already thinks the election is over. He doesn't feel like any stimulus would help Trump or even his endangered frontline members. They're already done for, as the coronavirus is the most important issue in the election, and there's a raging outbreak at the White House. There was a poll yesterday showing Joe Biden up 16 points. There's another one showing a lead in the sample after Trump's positive test. Okay, in other words, what they did is when you split the sample into the part that answered the survey before the test and you take the part that answered the survey after Trump's positive test, in that subsample, you see that Biden has a lead of 22 points. That's the after-test sample. Dave says every Republican you think is not going to win is not going to win. And I think Dave is right. And by the way, Cenk Uygur also thinks that it's all over at this point. But we can't get too overconfident. Remember, Trump has all these great capabilities of coming back. I mean, look what he did against Hillary Clinton in 2016. That Trump, he's an evil genius, right? Anyway, McConnell, as pure a political animal as we have in America, is playing not for 2020, but 2022 and well beyond. His most important directive now is to get Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court and lock in that strong conservative Supreme Court majority for decades. His second most important directive is to deny Biden a half-decent economy propped up by the stimulus to make the beginning of his tenure difficult. Ordinary people and not even his fellow Republican colleagues don't factor into the election. Well, maybe that's so. In other words, that may be the way McConnell is thinking, but I don't think what he's thinking is so, because he's put into jeopardy so many of his colleagues that there could well be a Senate landslide as well as a presidential landslide. And if there is one, even if they get Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court, court packing really becomes a possibility. We'll talk about that, okay, in a little while. But going on, what looks like a political downside, in other words, is just McConnell banking on a future political upside. And that's right, it is. But he may be wrong about that. There may be no upside because when you gain total control of Congress, all kinds of things can be done to grab back strong control of the political system. Dave says, though, and he might be correct about this, probably is, that Mitch is plotting his comeback using the same script as 2009 and 2010. So what he may not be recognizing is that this isn't 2009 to 2010, is that as big as the Democratic majority was in 2009 to 2010, after this election, it might very well be bigger right now. And just because of what happened in 2009, 2010, there might be much greater pressure on Biden and Harris to do some good things so that when 2022 rolls around, they win that off-year election instead of getting swamped by the Republicans. We thought correctly, I think. The only way the American people would know that a great debate was going on was if the measures were not bipartisan. Okay, McConnell said about that time, when you hang the bipartisan tag on something, the perception is that differences have been worked out and there's a broad agreement that that's the way forward. So McConnell doesn't want to hang the bipartisan tag on. He wants everything the Democrats do to be partisan. Well, that can backfire on Mitch McConnell. Remember, in the 1930s, the Democrats did not do things on a bipartisan basis. They rammed everything through. And that led to 20 years of mostly Democratic control. And by the way, to Democratic control of the House of Representatives until the election of 1994. That's how long domination of the House by the Democrats lasted based on what happened in the 1930s. I think Mitch forgets that history, but I don't. Dave goes on. Now that he understands it, he'll not cooperate with Democrats on things like assistance for the American people. Dave says, we're in a plutonomy now, so everyone McConnell cares about has already been helped. He will offer that great debate between now and the 2022 election. He may offer it, but he may not be able to do more than debate about it, because he may not have enough power to block anything after this election. He'll hope to win back his majority in the midterms. I'm hoping that's going to be a forlorn hope. And even if he does not, he will have the Supreme Court for a generation. That assumes no court packing. It assumes no impeachment. It also assumes no use of Article 3, Section 2 to strip the jurisdiction away from the court in relation to key legislation that the Green New Deal is going to pass. And even if he does not, he will have the Supreme Court for a generation. Well, as I said, in fact, that's part of the plan. If they obstruct forward movement in Biden's first 2 years, then McConnell can blame him for lack of action. I hope that Biden understands that. I hope he understands that he has to move forward or face the misery Obama had after his first 2 years came in office. And Dave points out this was all foreseeable. And he says there's a theory that in a month after Democrats win resoundingly, they can announce several stimulus measures they will adopt, and this will stabilize things. But a lot of scarring can happen in the 78 days between the election and the inauguration. The risk of undershooting the recovery, as Fed Chair Jay Powell said yesterday, far outstrips the risk of overshooting it. And Dave's right about that. Then he says, if I could recognize this in March without a giant staff and access to every economist on the planet, then the Democratic leadership could have known it too. Instead, they arrogantly believed they could come back for more. People inside of the caucus who warned of this are seething. Quote, it's emblematic of the total lack of urgency from the top even now. What a tragic disaster, unquote, said one House Democratic aide. Quote, just calm down, unquote, said Nancy Pelosi to Jake Tapper in April when asked if not getting state and local government relief might have been a mistake. Dave says, I haven't been calm since then. This was political malpractice of the highest order. Anyone could see that the CARES Act was not going to be enough. Just adding the words, quote, for the duration of the national emergency, unquote, to every measure in that bill would have made a huge difference. Instead, here we are. I have to remind Dave and everybody else, this wasn't the first time there was political malpractice by Nancy Pelosi. She collaborated with Barack Obama in 2009 and 2010 to create the political malpractice of the Affordable Care Act, which got the Democrats swamped in the election of 2010. That was political malpractice too. Instead of passing a Medicare for All Act, a nice, clean 35-page bill, H.R. 76, by the end of February in 2009, and instead of passing a far larger stimulus bill than the one they passed in early February of 2009, they went with compromise bills in hopes of getting Republican support. They got none, of course. So all they did was botch things up in a lengthy struggle, against the Republicans, which they manufactured themselves because they were looking for bipartisan support instead of ramming it through. They should have rammed those two bills through, then started working on a Green New Deal right then and there in 2010. They would have saved the world and themselves and the American people a lot of grief. They botched it up then. They got a second chance now. They botched it up again. Get rid of Pelosi. She's the botcher. Get rid of Schumer. He's another botcher. They come from a bad class of Democratic representatives who remember only the time when the Republicans were running rampant and their neoliberal ideology was taking control of the nation. These people cannot forget that time. They cannot get past it. They cannot go beyond it. They have to go. Dave says, he finishes, they say that victory has 100 fathers, but failure is an orphan. Not true in this case. A lot of people share the blame for this mess. It was what some of us mean by bipartisanship. That was neatly done. So now a little more news, just to put the right emphasis on all this. We have Something from Common Dreams today. Trump has abandoned them. 1.3 million new unemployment claims. Yes, the unemployment claims came out. They came out today. Unemployment claims for September, or for the last week actually. 1.3 million new unemployment claims spotlight unthinkable consequences of refusing the relief package. But this is by Jake Johnson. The Labor Department reported today that around 1.3 million additional Americans filed for unemployment benefits last week, as the economy continued to falter without the kind of stimulus that experts say is necessary to stem the crisis and relieve the widespread hunger, housing insecurity, and joblessness. Terribly high numbers of jobless claims point to a slowing recovery, with over 25 million collecting benefits. Tweeted Don Beyer. He's a Democrat from the Virginia 8th Congressional District, where I used to live. He's my old congressman. Quote, Trump has abandoned them, said Don, who, by the way, made his money as a Volvo dealer here in the local area and later became ambassador to Switzerland under Obama. Anyway, Trump is abandoning people by abandoning the stimulus in the face of another week of 1.3 million new unemployment claims. Nancy Pelosi has dismissed the idea of moving any standalone relief bills. Said there's not going to be any standalone bill unless there is a bigger bill, and it can be part of that, or it could be in addition to it, she said to reporters today. Last week, the House passed a $2.2 trillion compromise relief package without the support of a single Republican. And Mitch McConnell has refused to allow a vote on the measure, as you know. And Nancy Pelosi also raised questions about the president's mental and physical condition, and vaguely announced she'll be discussing the 25th Amendment on Capitol Hill tomorrow. The president is, shall we say, in an altered state right now. She's accusing Trump of having lost control due to drugs. She said, I don't know how to answer for that the behavior. According to the Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey, nearly 78 million U.S. adults, wow, that's almost a fourth of the country, not just adults, a fourth of the country, was struggling to afford basic expenses such as food and rent. Boy, these people must be in a state of total fury against the Trump administration as they cast their early votes, as they cast their votes by mail. I'm sure many of them, those who are young enough that they don't feel that threatened by COVID, will also manage to get to the polls on Election Day and exact their revenge. Heidi Shierholz of the Economic Policy Institute wrote that it is terrible economics to cut off the stimulus talks as mass layoffs continue at an unprecedented rate. The extra $600 in weekly unemployment insurance benefits was supporting a huge amount of spending by people who without it have to make drastic cuts, Shearhold said. And quote again, cutting off talks also means no additional housing and nutrition assistance, no COVID-related health and safety measures for workers, no aid to the Postal Service during this critical time, and no additional support for virus testing, tracing, and isolation measures, or virus treatment and support for hospitals and other health providers. All of these things would have helped our economy and the people in it recover from the COVID crisis. Cutting it off is unthinkable at a time like this. But Trump thought of it. Trump thought of it. He's such a novel thinker that it wasn't unthinkable for him. What was unthinkable for him was to lose a negotiation to a woman. That's what was unthinkable for him. So what was Pelosi talking about when she hinted about what was going to happen? What was going to happen? What was she thinking about? What was in her mind? Well, there was another article in Common Dreams, and that other article talked about after Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis, Pelosi and Raskin, that's Jamie Raskin, to propose creating commission on presidential capacity. The office of the House Speaker announced on Thursday that the California Democrat and a congressman who is a constitutional law expert are planning to unveil legislation that would create a commission on presidential capacity. That is Nancy Pelosi meeting with Representative Jamie Raskin, who lives in Maryland. Maybe you should go over to his house. I don't know. They're going to hold a Friday morning press conference to introduce the measure, which would establish the commission, quote, to help ensure effective and uninterrupted leadership in the highest office in the executive branch of government, unquote. And she announced during her conference on Thursday, she urged the reporters to return to Capitol Hill tomorrow because, quote, we're going to be talking about the 25th Amendment, unquote, of the Constitution, which outlines the transfer of power procedures if the president is removed from office, resigns, or dies. The proposal is expected to reflect the legislation Raskin originally introduced in 2017 that would establish a commission to determine presidential fitness for office as outlined by the Constitution's 25th Amendment. And Raskin told The Hill shortly after Trump tested positive last week, quote, I've got my 25th Amendment, the legislation from the last Congress, H.R. 1987, which I'm going to be dusting off and reintroducing. Well, of course, that hasn't passed. He has to reintroduce it, and the Senate has to pass it. Is there any reason to believe the Senate would pass it? It would establish a bipartisan commission that would, at the direction of Congress, carry out a medical examination of the president. He can determine whether he's mentally or physically unable to discharge the powers and duties of the office. 11-member commission would be appointed by leaders of the House and Senate. The commission, in its past bill, would be required to report its findings to Congress. So what is this move about? It may be about removing Trump in very short order, though Mitch McConnell probably would support that. But if this is after November 3rd, and Trump looks like he's going to be a danger to the stability of the government or to the stability of the United States, I mean, who knows what Mitch McConnell would do? You really don't know. The president responded to Pelosi's 25th Amendment comment on Twitter, declaring, "Crazy Nancy is the one who should be under observation. They don't call her crazy for nothing." So the little kid went back to his playground tactics. Pelosi and Raskin's Friday unveiling will come after the president's behavior, including firing off several tweets early Monday, has generated alarm throughout the week. Finally, Trump's tweeting is getting to people. Walter Schaub, former director of the Office of Government Ethics, tweeted Monday that Trump's insane, and he capitalized that. Twitter storm this morning is making the case for his cabinet to invoke the 25th Amendment. Maybe they will invoke the 25th Amendment. I'm not sure that Pence would block that. He might join in the effort. Why would he join in the effort? I don't know. I'm not sure. But I think there's something else that we have to consider. Specifically, the last thing I want to talk about tonight is the Supreme Court. It was an article that appeared in Slate. I picked it up in reader-supported news. It's by Dahlia Lithwick, who's one of the leading writers on the Supreme Court, one of the leading people who reports on what's going on in the court, analyzing it, commenting on it. She co-authored an article with Mark Joseph Stern, and the title is "The Supreme Court Term Will End with Either Catastrophe or 13 Justices." And this is what she foresees. She thinks maybe the Democrats are not going to be able to stop the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Of course, she thinks this is a disaster. And she says that Democrats, meanwhile, have been slow to catch up to what the Republicans are doing, going full speed ahead on the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. At the first debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, Biden refused to say whether he'd expand the Supreme Court if the Republicans confirm Amy Coney Barrett, insisting that the issue is a distraction. And Dahlia Lithwick and Mark Joseph Stern say he's wrong, broaching the conversation about systemic reform after the election will be too late. Oh, by the way, the Democrats were helped, if they want to start this conversation, because Pence started it for them in the debate with Harris yesterday, trying to buttonhole her on whether the Democrats would be packing the court. And she wouldn't say what the Democrats would do, because Biden told her not to say what the Democrats would do. I personally would have said, well, that really depends on what you do. I mean, you've been packing the courts for ages, including the Supreme Court, and now you're trying to pack it again with the unprecedented move of trying to confirm a justice 1 month before an election, actually 1 month before election day, but while that very election is already going on in many states. Now that's an act of Supreme Court packing if I ever saw one. So I think she should have said, if you continue this act of Supreme Court packing, you can't expect us to take this lying down. We're going to get back the Senate and also the House and probably the presidency this time. And when we do, we're not going to hesitate to make a change in the structure of the Supreme Court. As Dahlia Lithwick says, okay, the debate about structural changes to the court can't wait until a hypothetical future in which everything is settled down. That future has already vanished. On the docket, just in the weeks to come, there's a blockbuster case that seeks to put a stake through the heart of the Affordable Care Act in the midst of a pandemic, a challenge Barrett would seem to favor. So as soon as the Democrats get into office, they have to put a Band-Aid on that. If they do take over, I mean, people are going to elect them to put a Band-Aid on that. Because they seem to be running on that, indicating that Amy Coney Barrett is going to overturn the ACA. So that's one of the reasons many people are going to be voting for them, okay, in an effort to save the ACA. Well, that can't stop Amy Coney Barrett, but it can create a situation where there can be a new care act of some kind going to the desk of the president as soon as the inauguration takes place. That is, a new act can be passed in January, but not sent to the executive branch quite yet. In other words, the new Congress can pass it, but not send it on to the White House until the inauguration has occurred. But it could be done and ready for Biden to sign as soon as he comes into office. So, if there is a stake through the heart of the Affordable Care Act, that's going to trigger a debate about what should be passed in its place. The safest thing to pass in its place, okay, is a Medicare for All bill for the duration of the pandemic at least. We'll have to see what happens. But I don't think the Republicans are going to have a say in that. Going on. Also on the docket is a case about a Philadelphia foster care agency that refuses to work with same-sex couples and claims that it constitutes religious discrimination if the city refuses to subsidize it. That is, subsidize the foster care agency that refuses to work with same-sex couples with taxpayer dollars. In other words, another attack on the separation of church and state by the fanatical Catholic about to be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. In case that weren't enough, the court may also hear a case that could strip same-sex couples of equal parenting rights. Moving from religion to guns, the court has been itching to expand the Second Amendment, and Barrett has made plain that she would go further than even most conservative judges to permit guns. The court will also hear a case that could kill off what's left of the Voting Rights Act. Plus, there are multiple reproductive freedom cases hurtling toward the court, many from states that have already overruled Roe v. Wade in practice. Outright abortion bans. There are regulations designed to shutter clinics. There are medically unnecessary restrictions on the use of medications during abortions. All that, plus an election in which the court may pick the next president and further restrict voting rights. And did we mention a census case that could strip congressional representation from states with large immigrant populations? So the article goes on about this. She says, in the face of these impending calamities for democracy, Democrats have a binary choice. They can accept the legitimacy of a court whose membership has been yanked far to the right by Republicans' anti-democratic schemes, or they could add seats to the court and spare the country from the Sarlacc pit into which it's poised to tumble. I must confess, I don't know what a Sarlacc pit is. Maybe the Sarlacc pit is from Star Wars. It's a place where prisoners went to, I suppose, to do mining in Star Wars. Anyway, how esoteric. Democrats are hesitant to talk about expanding the Supreme Court. They prefer to focus on the fight against Amy Coney Barrett, but her confirmation now seems all but inevitable. Democrats are urging, progressives are urging Democrats to start considering their counterattack. Chuck Schumer has said nothing is off the table next year if Republicans ram Amy Coney Barrett through the Senate. So even Chuck Schumer is talking tougher than Harris talked last night. And Lithwick says, a vague gesture toward at least the possibility of court expansion. Senator Joe Manchin, a moderate Democrat, has disavowed it altogether. Joe Biden has tried to split the difference. He generally refuses to talk about court expansion, but has implied that he opposes it for now. He says, quote, we need to de-escalate, not escalate, he said on September 20th. That's why I appeal to those few Senate Republicans, the handful who really will decide what happens. So basically Biden is saying he's not going to increase the number of justices in the court or try to increase the number of justices in the court if he wins and if Amy Coney Barrett is blocked and he gets the pick to the Supreme Court. That's his stance for now. That's why he was unwilling to have Harris say anything about that and why she danced around it and didn't give an answer to Pence when he was pestering her for a commitment so they could run against whatever the Democrats had to say. Court expansion remains supposedly relatively unpopular among the American public. So a cautious approach makes sense in this political moment, says Bedalia Lithic. But in the longer term, it is a recipe for disaster. Say Democrats decide against expanding the court after Barrett's confirmation, instead choosing to pass their progressive agenda, then they wait a few years to see what the reception will be by the Supreme Court. What's likely to happen then is, just as happened in the 1930s, the terribly conservative Republican Supreme Court is going to overturn all the things passed by the Democrats when they were in control of the Congress. And the Democrats might not even see that agenda get destroyed until after they've lost the majority again. Because how can they be sure they're still going to have the majority? I mean, Roosevelt was lucky when they started declaring his stuff unconstitutional. He still had big margins. Why? Because he was really progressive in his approach to legislation. He just passed a whole bunch of things to see if it would stick, to see what would work. And that made him popular. So people returned him with increased majorities in 1934 and in 1936. And when he started having all kinds of problems with the Supreme Court, he was in a position to threaten court packing and to change the courts. Will Joe Biden be in such a position? Not if he doesn't act like FDR when he gets in. So Lithwick foresees how a Supreme Court unfriendly to the administration and out of touch with the American people could eviscerate the plans to protect abortion rights, the plans to grant statehood to D.C. and to Puerto Rico, the attempts to strengthen voting rights and ethics and redistricting reforms. It could all be strangled by the judiciary, and would probably be. Unless the Democrats are in a position to keep heavy majorities, they won't be able to do anything about it. So what Lithwick advises is that if Democrats plan to expand the court, they have to do it quickly, before the Republicans could hit back. They must strike before the conservative supermajority has a chance to undermine them. If they wait for provocation, give this a few years to play out in the judicial branch, they will simply see their agenda torn to shreds by the court 2 years later, after Republicans have wrestled back the Senate court expansion. So she says, court expansion is not a hypothetical response to some future SCOTUS outrage. It is a proportional response to Republicans' constitutional hardball and a necessary precursor to any meaningful democratic reform. I, of course, completely agree. She asks, is there a political cost to announcing the Democrats' plan to play constitutional hardball effective immediately, whether it be scaring off some of the moderate voters, or emboldening Mitch McConnell to implement the self-same ideas if he still controls the Senate come January? She says, surely there is. But she says the cost of hanging around for a few years, hoping that statesmanship and comedy rise like a phoenix from the ash heap of the Senate, is far greater. The equivalent of bringing a sparkly pony to a knife fight. The court is already lost for a generation. Retaking the White House and the Senate in November will do nothing to solve that problem. Bold and big action on court reform on day one of a new administration isn't a fanciful hope. It may be the only lifeline that remains. I don't think that's quite right. There's another lifeline. That lifeline is jurisdictional stripping of what the courts, including the Supreme Court, are able to submit to judicial review. The types of cases that the Supreme Court is able to take up can be limited under Article 3, Section 2, which contains the exceptions clause, it outlines Congress's power to limit of the jurisdiction of the appellate courts, so that they can take up certain kinds of cases. For example, campaign finance cases. The Congress could rule it out of bounds for courts, for the appellate courts to rule on campaign finance cases. It could do the same thing with voting rights cases. It could do the same thing with statehood cases. It could do the same thing with Green New Deal cases. There are whole classes of cases that can be removed from the authority of the Supreme Court using the authority of Congress outlined in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution. I'm sure I'll have occasion to talk about that in future live streams and in progressive short takes as well. So I'm going to stop now and entertain your comments as usual. I see more of you decided to arrive. That's good. Thank you. Kay says, also trying to listen to over. I guess I entertained some of these comments already. Kay says, we hope, Joe, but shows it is already a movement with the militias. Yeah, there is a movement going on with the militias. But, the militias may yet chicken out. We have to see. And Janet May says, Joe Biden didn't sound so good today, raspy voice. Hi, Janet. Nice to see you again. And Kay says, what did Kay say? She said, I didn't hear him today. He was supposed to be in Arizona. He's probably traveling too much already. Janet says, no one even knows the last time Trump had a test before the debate. He refuses to tell. Yeah, it's probably because he's a super spreader. And Janet May says he was. And Joanne says, Lord knows we need Sanders, but I will vote against Trump. Yeah, we badly needed Bernie. I don't think Bernie should have given up. That was not good for us. Steve says Pence has canceled his appearances and is heading back to Washington. Oh, so maybe Pence has come back positive himself. Joanne says disgusting disgrace. Kay says he was supposed to be here in Columbus in a couple of days. Maybe he's positive too. And Joanne says anti-maskers should be charged with assault. Yes, which reminds me, there was something I meant to cover today, which I did not, and I do want to cover it. There was a post in Counterpunch. It was by Laura Flanders, and she asked the question, if the president had HIV, he could be in prison. And she asked, could Donald Trump be charged with a crime for knowingly exposing others to an infectious disease? He said he could if that disease was hepatitis. If the Donald was a poor man, poorly defended and in poor health, there's a good chance he'd be facing criminal charges. Under laws that Republicans have enthusiastically backed, If Donald Trump had HIV, he could be locked up in prison. According to the Center for HIV Law and Policy, 13 states currently have laws on the books that apply to stiff penalties to people who expose others to hepatitis and other contagious diseases. 32 states similarly criminalize people living with HIV, even if there is no intent, no threat, and no disease is actually transmitted. And Flanders goes on in that particular vein. So I'm not going to go through this whole article, but the moral of the story, okay, is obvious. She's not really for criminalization. What she is for is an end to the hypocrisy in the Trump camp concerning COVID and actions by Trump and his people to conform to good behavior with respect to the virus. There was a bill in the Congress. So far, according to the new tracker on the Zero Project website, the only COVID criminalization bill introduced in the U.S. was sponsored by Republican State Senator, now Congressman Chris Jacobs of New York, whom Donald Trump endorsed twice via Twitter. Jacobs' bill came in response to a story about a Buffalo man spitting on a police officer while being arrested. Back then, things were different. Back then, the Justice Department was warning that if people were malicious coronavirus spreaders, they could be charged with terrorism. The people in the crosshairs were people of color, immigrants, felons, protesters, and the Chinese, not a predator president turned super spreader. It's not his DNA of which he's so inordinately proud, says Laura Flanders. It's the DNA of our legal code that protects dangerous Donald. And of course, she's absolutely right. I thought you'd want to know about that particular one. It was, I thought, a particularly good one from Counterpunch. I have linked to it. Joanne says anti-maskers should be charged with assault. Janet May says Nancy Pelosi says no standalone for the airlines. Yeah, I know she said that. Steve says, the USPS is getting wacky in LA. My office is receiving checks mailed a month ago. Well, at least you're still receiving the checks. That at least is good. But there's harm when checks are delayed by a month. Janet says, Moscow Mitch is frothing at the mouth, thinking about having a conservative court. Well, I don't know whether frothing describes it. I think that usually refers to licking of one's chops. Janet May said, I heard that the employees are working overtime for free and trying to prioritize the mail to keep it going. Janet May says, geez, crazy stuff. Steve says, very crazy. Steve says, it's looking like the Dems will retake the Senate. I think they'll retake it by a big margin. I think you'll be surprised at how big the margin's going to be. Kay says, I hope so, Steve. Kay says, hopefully, Kay with many progressives. Steve says, that fly was kind of weird. I mean, what the fuck was that? Well, you know, with Bernie Sanders, a bird lands on him. What was it? A bird landed on his shoulders or flew around him and landed right in front of him or something. A nice bird. Trump, on the other hand, got a fly. He got a fly on his white hair. On his silver white hair. Kay says, I hear it now has its own Twitter page too, laugh out loud. Oh, the fly, you mean. Steve says, AOC should primary Schumer. Yeah, I'd love to see that, if only for the entertainment. Kay says, Pegosi is now going to talk about the 25th Amendment. Shake my head. Too little, too late. Well, that's Pegosi. Too little, too late. Subtitles said butcher instead of botcher, Dr. Joe. Laugh out loud. Yeah, butcher is a more common word than botcher. Joanne says, gotta go. I'll rewatch later. Thanks, Joanne. Steve says, Stephen Wolfbrandt, that is, says, works either way. Janet says, that's tomorrow, right? Yeah, that's tomorrow. And Barbara Wernick says, right? People are of no consequence. Evelina says, it does. Steve Wolfbrandt, it does. Evelina says, infuriating it is. Doc, who invokes the 25th Amendment? The House? No. It's, I think it has to be a majority of the Congress. I'm sorry, it has to be a majority of the cabinet. Okay, I believe. And I think it has to have also the collaboration of the vice president. It doesn't go forward without the collaboration of the vice president. Kay says, I think the White House administration has to actually do it, though, Steve. Steve says, where's Melania? She's supposed to be in the White House convalescing. I hope she isn't crazy enough to visit Trump. Steve says, November will be crazy havoc. Be careful, people. Yes, I agree. It will be crazy. I'm glad I already voted. Donnie already voted too. Kay says, she's sick too, Steve, hiding out. Kay says, I know, Steve. First time in my life, I have no gun too. Evelina says, Dahlia is right. Catastrophe. She said catastrophe or 13 justices. My own preference is for 15 justices. I agree with you, Evelina. 15 justices is what we need. We need to have Biden able to appoint 6 justices. So we have a 9-6 majority, and then let's see how they like it. And then we need to impeach Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas just for good measure. Evelina says, Janet Mays and beyond. And Kay says, Biden has no comment in SCOTUS. Still trying to suck in the GOP. Shake my head. Yeah, Biden's always been so cuddly with the GOP. Barbara says, are you serious? In 2020, she cannot be confirmed. No, she cannot be. In 2020, she cannot be confirmed. There's still time for them to confirm her. If the Democrats' resistance is weak, which thus far it's been very, very weak, they may be able to confirm her. It depends. I think a lot depends on how many in the Judiciary Committee come down with COVID. We don't know how that's going to play out yet. We should know in a few days, though, because it's been, 3 or 4 days since Ron Johnson was tested positive. So the others that he had lunch with last week have had time to incubate it. So we should be finding out in the next few days how many of them were brought low also. Kay says, here in Ohio, the Alabama, the North Coast. I thought that was central Pennsylvania, probably both places. Shake my head, hope I can get out of here again someday. Well, don't go to central Pennsylvania. It's another place like that. Steve says, packing the court is not good precedent. Oh, come on. How do you think the court got to 9 justices in the first place? Packing the court is fine if the court gets structurally out of balance. And when I say structurally out of balance, I don't mean out of balance in relation to the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. That's not what this is about. What this is about is how far removed the court is from political opinion and sentiment in the country. They're looking to turn the clock back to before FDR. I mean, the country has moved on. Public opinion has moved on. When the public sees these decisions and feels the effects of the decisions that get handed down by the court, the public is going to go over to the building and try to burn it down. Barbara says he will do nothing. Biden, I mean. Yeah, well, it's a pretty good bet he'll do nothing. Steve Wolfbrand says, unfortunately, she can and probably will be confirmed. You know, unless the Democrats resist very strongly, or if COVID lays everybody low, or enough of them low, she probably will be confirmed. Evelina says, why not Steve? Carmen says, yay, got captions again. Sorry so late. Headaches got me word out. Kay says, if she is, there goes the ACA and row 2. Evelina says, why isn't expanding the court a good thing? Expanding the court would be a good thing if the court you expand is out of touch with the people of the United States, as this court would certainly be. I mean, this court was manufactured by plutocratic money over a very long period of time, and it is out of step with the needs of the United States and the values of the American people and the opinions of the American people. Carmen says, wiped out, frickin' autocorrect. Kay says, going to be a must if they push through with this one. Evelina. Steve says, Evelina, because if the Republicans eventually comes into power, they could do the same thing. Yes, Steve, but that's not enough of a fear to stop from doing what needs to be done now. I mean, look at the way the Republicans have acted. They've never taken the position that, oh, this is not a good thing to do because when the Democrats get into power, they might really treat us badly and do the same kinds of things we've been doing. When did Mitch McConnell allow that to stop him? We can't allow it to stop us either. We have to correct the balance so the court is in line with the country again. And we probably do need to expand the court by 6 justices to make that happen. If we do it right and we pass the legislation the country needs, then the Republicans will not get back into power anytime soon. Again, remember, Steve, once the Democrats gained control of the House, but during the 1930s, from that time until 1995, they had control of the House, except, I believe, for a 2-year period, if I recall correctly, right at the start of the Eisenhower administration. I think in 1953 and 54, they had control of the House when Eisenhower won. And the Democrats regained control as a result of the election of 1954. And from there on until the election of 1994, they retained control of the House. And of course, they had control of the House from 1933 to 1947 as well. Okay, I know the Republicans took over Congress in 1946, but I don't know if they took over the House too. It might have only been the Senate, or it might have been both the Senate and the House. The Democrats were repudiated in 1946 and then came back and took control again in 48. Barbara Wernick said, expand the court immediately. Exactly. Carmen says, did you guys discuss Nancy Pelosi tonight? Yes, somewhat. We did. Little Carmen. Stephen Wolfbrand. Evelina says to Steve Wolfbrand, how would Republicans need to anyway? And Carmen says, thanks. Deborah Wilson says, you are brilliant on SCOTUS. I'm going to assume that's me, Deborah, so thank you. Barbara says, it is. Republicans have tried to stack the court. We must keep the courts on an equal status. Yes. Evelyn says, interesting, certain issues can be taken out from the Supreme Court. Yeah. Look at Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2. It's very short. It must be 10 words in Article 3, Section 2. Steve says, well, I think if we pack the court, when we have the opportunity, Republicans will do the same when they get the chance. Could spiral out of control. I agree, but it's the Republicans who have started this. It's the Republicans who started this. Just remember, they're the ones who have been appointing justices not in line with the American people. They have appointed right-wing justice after right-wing justice for years. They blocked, the legitimate nomination, of Merrick Garland, who, by the way, was too much the centrist. Obama deliberately nominated him in order to try to get some of the Republicans to support a floor vote for Garland because he was a centrist justice who was not too dangerous for them. And Mitch still blocked his confirmation. And as a result of that, Gorsuch was nominated. Gorsuch, and confirmed. Gorsuch would not be there now. Garland would be there now. Instead, except the Republicans played dirty. They've been playing dirty for years. They need to face the consequences of their actions. If we don't make them face the consequences of their actions, they're just going to keep doing it to us. They'll keep doing it. They're not going to stop doing it to us. Out of the goodness of their heart, they'll appoint more and more and more conservative justices. They'll invalidate more and more and more bills. At some point, this feckless party has to reply with tough measures of its own. Otherwise, they're useless. Well, they're useless anyway. We know they're useless. But it's up to them to show us they're not useless. And that means expanding the court. Not packing it, expanding the court. It's been expanded a number of times in our history. Kay says, yes, it is, Evelina Pont. I wasn't aware of that either. Now opens up a whole new can of worms. Why hasn't it been done already? Because there are lots of things allowed by the Constitution that haven't been done already. And there are many things that have been done, that are allowed in the Constitution. Like, for example, the filibuster is not explicitly advanced in the Constitution. It's something the Senate invented. The Constitution calls for majority vote. So what happened? They had a majority vote in the Senate over a period of years, a number of them, which allowed the filibuster, to develop. Now all of a sudden everybody thinks, oh, we can't do anything to get rid of the filibuster. First thing we need to do is get rid of the filibuster so we can pass bills with a majority vote, and we don't have to talk to the Republicans to pass any bills. Once we don't have to talk to them, they're going to become a lot more reasonable because they're going to want to talk to the Democrats. And they're going to say, please, Democrats, let us talk to you. Let us talk to you. We'll be nice. We'll be nice. Carmen says, I considered the COVID super spreader Adolf Hitler going to jail the other day and wondered why it hasn't been brought up, because Barr is just going to tell you under Justice Department policy, you cannot prosecute the president for anything because you'll distract him from the important duties he has every day, such as spreading COVID to the rest of the American people. Barbara Wernick said, if you put people at risk, should you be liable? Damn well you should be liable. And Evelyn says, sure, there's a limit set by the Constitution. You can't have an infinite number. No, there's no limit of justices set by the Constitution. You can have an infinite number. Well, obviously you can't have an infinite number because Congress wouldn't have the time to expand to an infinite number. Carmen says, man, Barr did some crooked shit to thwart voting. I just haven't followed up on it. Cases, actually, there is no limit in the Constitution. Nancy says, but Nancy Goslin Blackmore says, great evening, Dr. Joe. Keep it coming. Thank you, Nancy. Carmen says, TikTok is doing some hilarious Pence fly skits. Evelina says, huh? And Carmen says, and cuddly with the Klan. And Carmen says, is Christie on tubes now? Steve says, how is fat Chris Christie doing? I don't know. Kay says, Evelina Pond, Tom Hartman did a whole historical lesson on it today. I always share him on Facebook. You should check it out. You mean on Article 3, Section 2? Carmen Muniz says he's blubbering along. And Barbara Wernick said packing the court, okay, is dangerous. Sure, it's dangerous. They've packed it already. And we need to show them why it's dangerous to play the packing the court game. Steve says, I'm afraid not. Evelina. And Carmen says, he looks very emaciated these days. Does he have cancer? And Steve Wolfbrand said, correct, no limit. And Kay says, who, Hartman? No, he's fine. Yeah, he does look kind of thin these days. I noticed that too. Evelyn says, thanks, Kay, I missed it. And Steve Wolfbrand said, the House should be much larger as well. It should grow with the population. Yeah, I think it should be larger too. And I think the Senate should be promoted to the status of the House of Lords. In other words, it should become like a body that cannot do anything, was simply gotten rid of. Carmen says, so I heard COVID causes a jelly-like substance in the lungs. Yeah, it blocks up the lungs. I don't know if that's something new or just not announced earlier. No, I think that's been known for a long time. I think John Campbell talked about how COVID blocks up the lungs. And that's how people die. In other words, it blocks up the lungs. That's caused by the cytokine storm. Kay says, Hartman writes many books on history and of politics too. Yes, I've written a number of books also, you may have noticed on my website. think there are 9 books on my website. And Carmen says, read, correction. Evelina says, wouldn't that be phlegm? No, it's not phlegm. Carmen says, Dr. Joe is our bridge over troubled waters. Got inspired by the background just now. Steve says it can cause, quote, shattered glass, unquote, in the lungs. Can also attack other organs as well as the nervous system and the brain. It's such a wonderful thing, COVID is. Carmen Rita says, Evelina, not much worse. Kay says, I hope people wake up and stop voting GOP. They won't help anyone but the rich. Carmen says, what's this about Barrett being a handmaid in her cult? I think a handmaid is just an advisor to newer people in the cult. I think it was the word they used, okay, for advisor when they first started off, which was way before the book about the handmaids that got serialized. I don't think it has quite the same connotation. But I think there is a male supremacy shtick in their cult, in their Catholic sect. I think that is part of their doctrine. I don't know if that means that Amy Coney Barrett is always going to defer to John Roberts or not. Barbara Wernick says we need a competitive field. Yes. And Carmen says gerrymandering is a Republican invention to cheat too, isn't it? I don't know whether Eldridge Jerry, I think his name was Eldridge Jerry, if I recall correctly. Eldridge, it was Eldridge or L Bridge, I'm not sure. The gerrymander is named after a guy by the name of Eldridge Jerry. Oh, Elbridge Jerry, evidently. Let's see, Elbridge. Elbridge Jerry, gerrymandering. Elbridge Jerry, Elbridge Thomas Jerry. Was an American politician and a diplomat. As a Democratic Republican, that was the party founded by Jefferson he ran under their banner in the election of 1800. He was the 5th vice president of the United States. The political practice of gerrymandering is named after Jerry. Now, that party was the Democratic hyphen Republican Party, and it was the precursor of the Democratic Party. Okay, what happened is the Federalist Party was eventually destroyed. In other words, its main competitor. It faded out of existence. Okay, and at that point, there was only one party in the United States surviving, and it was the Democratic hyphen Republican Party. And that party then split in two. And the left wing of it was run by Andrew Jackson. And he founded what later became the Democratic Party. In other words, there's been a direct succession to the Democratic Party that we have now. So I think it's fair to say the political practice, of gerrymandering was actually invented by a Democrat and not by a Republican. Sorry about that. Steve says COVID can also attack blood vessels as well, causing strokes. Janet May says, so the Republicans are not worth listening to. Prime example would be the impeachment hearings. And Steve Wolfbrand says, congressional districts should be rectangular to fix gerrymandering. That would help, I think. Kay says, yes, it is Carmen Muniz. I think it was started right here in Ohio, too. And Steve Wolfbrand says, Carmen says, Steve Wolfbrand, right? That's why it's said to be a Brady-kind storm now. Oh, that's a new finding. So they no longer call it a cytokine storm. They call it a Brady-kind storm. Kay says, history on the SCOTUS. Kay says, I have followed Hartman for many years. That's where I met Bernie. Carmen says, Dr. Joe, do you really think Adolf has COVID? Yeah, I certainly do, because he's been spreading it to everybody under the sun. Carmen says, so you should ask him out. Carmen says, and something Mander. Kay says, he's married for many years, laugh out loud. Yeah, laugh out loud and salamander. Thanks for looking that up. Interesting. But maybe Tom Hartman will write a book on it. I think a lot of people have written on the gerrymander. Barbara Wernick says, wow, surprising. He already has, I think, the war on voting, I think. Yes, Brady-kind, says Carmen Muniz. Okay, folks, I think I've caught up to you. I think we're just about done. Tomorrow I will be off, except I may try to do a short take, but I have a lot of work of another kind to do tomorrow. I don't know if I'll get to it, so I'll try to get to it on Saturday. I have another 2 short takes I had scheduled for this week, but I've never gotten to do them. Evelina says, silly goose, you, laugh out loud. Okay. Anyway, thanks for coming. Thanks for staying. I am going to say good night, and I'll see you again on Saturday night. When I'm not going to have completely a Q&A because I have some things that I want to catch up on, but I'm going to have plenty of discussion on Saturday night in any case. And Steve says, good night. And Dolores Pierce says, thank you and good night all. Thank you, Dolores. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. I hope everybody has been sharing. Barbara says, thank you, Joe. You're awesome. Well, thank you, Barbara, for coming. And thank you, Deborah, for coming as well. Good night, everyone.